Good morning, happy Wednesday. It is day 3 of our Rooted Devotional, and this morning we're talking about where it all goes wrong, Genesis 3. This is the story that sets up the plot conflict for the entire rest of the Bible. Without this story, we probably don't have the Bible because this is where everything goes wrong, and it sets the rest of the course on the Bible. It sets God on a course to make things right. So within this one chapter, you're going to read the entire chapter today. You're going to see where it all goes wrong, but then also get a picture for how God is already planning to make things right in the end. So it starts with this curious character, the serpent, who slithers into the garden. And this is really important because where it all went wrong is not just with humans. There's something outside of us, some crafty other force. In the ancient world, serpents were looked upon not just as crafty, but as a source of evil, right? And so you have this other source of evil coming in and whispering to the woman, leading her to make this decision. So it wasn't just the woman's decision. She was almost guided into making this decision by a voice that wasn't her own. That's really important when we look at how bad things come about in Scripture. Even in the next chapter, in Genesis 4, what you see is it's not always humans alone making bad choices. There's a voice whispering to them that is outside of themselves. It's like what Paul says, I don't do the things I want to do and I can't quite figure out why. Well, it's likely because there's another voice whispering to us. And this voice whispers to the woman, basically telling her the opposite of what God had said. God had said, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you're going to die. Not I will kill you, but it will lead to your death. There are two trees, the tree of life and the tree that leads to death. And what does she say? She says, she admits God told her that. We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden, but God said, you shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that's in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. Now, God never said don't touch it. He just said don't take from it. But the serpent continues, and he just kind of continues to poke the bear a little bit, to twist God's words, to cast some doubt into what God was saying. And so he says, you're not gonna die. He lied to you. At the minimum, he kind of over-exaggerated the truth. For God knows that when you eat of it, this is verse 5, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. This is a tragic sentence. The snake is trying to get them to see that by partaking of this tree, by deciding for themselves what is good and what is not good, something that was only supposed to be for God, they will be like God. It's like the snake is saying, God's way up here. Don't you want to be on his level? Like, you're way down here. Don't you want to come up to God's level and be like him? And the tragedy is that the humans were already like God. He made them in his image already. And they were called to be like God, partnering with God to subdue the earth and rule over it. They were already like God. But here you have the serpent telling them that that's not enough. They need a little bit more. If they truly want to be like God, then they have to define what is good and what is not good for themselves, rather than allowing God to be the one to define it for them. And after she hears this, in verse 6, the woman looks at the tree, and this is what happens. This language is so important. She sees that it is good for food and a delight to the eyes. She looks at it and she sees that it's desirable, it's good, it's a delight. And so what does she do? She takes it for herself. She took of its fruit and ate. This pattern of someone seeing something that is good or desirable or a delight to the eyes and taking it for themselves, even when it doesn't belong to them or when they should keep their hands off of it, this is a theme that is all over the Bible. I mean, any story of someone falling from grace, David and Bathsheba, he sees that she's desirable and takes her for himself. This exact language, this same pattern of seeing something and taking it is like a foundational part of the biblical story. Anytime you see these two words in close proximity to each other, you know that something is wrong. Something is going against God's plan. This is not what he wanted to happen. She takes the fruit and she eats it and she gives some to her husband. And the eyes of both of them were opened. They knew that they were naked. Being naked before this was never a bad thing, apparently. And now all of a sudden, they see it as a bad thing. They're defining what's good and not good for themselves. And here comes God, and they hide from him. In this garden, they had presumably been walking with God all this time. And now they see that they're naked, and that's not good. And now they're afraid or ashamed, or who knows what's going on. They hide from God. And this is just a pattern of what's to come, because they're going to be kicked out of the garden altogether here in just a few verses. So the Lord, seeing what had happened, he has this short conversation with Adam and Eve, but I want to get to the meat of the most important part of what God is going to do next. Starting in verse 14, he talks to three people, and he tells them the consequences of what's going to happen because of what they've just done. In verse 14, first, he looks at the serpent. So the serpent is presumably still there, or who knows how the serpent, maybe God pulled the serpent back. But either way, God turns to the serpent and he says, because you have done this, cursed are you above all livestock. Cursed are you, the serpent. God never curses the woman. He never curses the man. The only time he curses someone, a living being, is the serpent. That's really important. He says above all the beasts of it, on your belly you shall go, and the dust you shall eat. You're going to eat dust. Basically, your time is limited. You don't have much longer to live. All the days of your life. 15, here's the good part. I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. There are two offspring, two seeds that are being planted. One of the serpent and one of the woman. There are going to be two lineages from this point on in the Bible. Those who listen to the voice of the serpent and follow in this example of defining what's good and what's not good for themselves. They're going to be part of this lineage of the serpent. But then there's going to be a lineage of the woman, someone who will come and not define what's good or what's not good for themselves, but will follow God's definition of what is good and what is not good. And if you're not sure who that is, just like read the rest of the story. That one offspring, he shall bruise your head. It's a killing blow, crush the head of the serpent. This person is going to come and crush evil at its source, where it all began. This is going to take care of it. But at the same time, you shall bruise his heel. So the serpent is going to bruise the heel of the one who's destroying evil at its source. Now, if we live in Texas, so you probably know this, and if you don't, you've probably come across venomous snakes before. But what happens in a world where you don't have medical attention or supplies or anecdotes, and you get bit in the heel by a snake, a poisonous snake? You're not going to make it. Your time is limited, right? And so this is a mutually destructing blow. At the same time, evil is going to be crushed forever. This one who's doing the crushing, the snake crusher, is mutually destroyed. Mutually destroyed. Can you think of a story that kind of sounds like this, right? On page 3 of the Bible, God is already revealing that he has a plan to fix everything that's gone wrong. And it's going to be through this pattern of mutual destruction. At the very moment when evil is crushed forever, it's going to look like the victor, the snake crusher, is also destroyed. So then God says to the woman, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Now, the Hebrew gets a little complex here, but just what's important to know is God is not saying, I am going to curse you by making it hard to bear children. What he's saying is, because you've done this, the world that's going to be created now is one that Childbearing, not physically giving birth. That's not what he's talking about here. Childbearing is talking about the act of raising children. It's going to be painful and difficult and hard. I mean, think about in the ancient world how many mothers died in childbirth, or how hard it was to raise a baby in that kind of environment. That's what's being talked about here. Not just your labor pains. It's not talking about labor pains. It's talking about the act of raising children. And to Adam, he says, it's going to be a lot harder for you to eat. You're going to have to work harder. The ground is now cursed because of what you've done. Again, Adam and Eve aren't cursed. The ground and the serpent are cursed. But it's going to be, you're going to have to sweat to get your work. Because you've done this, you've now created a world where it's going to be harder for you. And think about this. When I choose to define what's good for me, it makes it harder for you sometimes, because what's good for me is not good for you, not always, and vice versa. Now think about when whole people groups decide to define what's good for themselves. Does it create a world where it's harder for others? This is what God's talking about. The world that's going to be created because humanity has decided to define what's good and what's not good for themselves is a difficult world. And now humanity is going to be right in the middle of that. The last thing I want to touch on is at the very end of this chapter. In verse 23, the Lord God takes these people that he had created from the garden and he puts them outside of it. And at the entrance to the garden, he places these two cherubim with a flaming sword in between them. Hannah talked about this when we were in our Matthew study, but if you look at the curtains of the temple that will come later in Israel's history, right at the Holy of Holies, the entrance to the temple has this depiction on it. It's two cherubim with flaming swords between them. And what this idea is saying is now there's a gate. There's something that's keeping us from being able to get to God's presence. We're not easily able to walk with God in the garden like we used to. The tree of life has been barred from us, because if we take from the tree of life now that we have tasted death, it's not going to be good. Something has to happen for us to be able to get back into the garden. And the whole rest of the biblical story is about the lengths that God will go to in order to make this happen. And if you're not sure what that looks like, or if you want to know where the story goes, just stick with us, because we're going there. We'll get there right around Christmas. We'll talk about what God does in order to bring humanity back into his presence and eventually get us back to a place where we are in the garden once more. For now, everything looks really dark and bad. This is not a fun story, but hope is coming, and it's the hope we celebrate every year at Christmas. I hope you're enjoying this plan. Let us know what you think. Email us, email me, email Matt. We'd love to hear from you. Hope you have a great day.